My name is Esme Dawson, 37 years old, an audio engineer living in the suburbs of Seattle in a house my mother left me before she passed. A year ago, I lost my hearing in an accident and became the silent woman in my own life. Everyone thought I was weak, harmless, incapable of hearing, incapable of fighting back. They didn't know. I had heard everything. Every lie, every scheme to steal what wasn't theirs. Every chilling word from the man I once believed was my entire world. She's like a pet, quiet, easy to manage, and legally valuable. I was standing right outside the kitchen when he said that. They thought I was still deaf. But this time, I wasn't going to stand still. Have you ever been betrayed by the person you loved the most? What would you do if you realized you were a pawn in their game? Leave a comment below, hit like, and follow the channel to hear the rest of this story, where silence is no longer weakness, but strength. 1 year ago, on a late autumn morning, I left the house with my mother's knitted scarf around my neck and a list of gifts Logan had casually mentioned throughout the month. It was his birthday. I had pre-ordered a vintage watch from the shop he liked, added a bottle of red wine, and picked up a few small pastries from the bakery where we had our first date. Nothing expensive, but I knew he'd understand, because those things meant something. I was walking across the parking lot, holding the gift box, when an SUV came speeding up behind me. Everything blurred after that, just a flash of white light and the sound of metal clashing, before all sound vanished. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, under harsh white lights and the sting of antiseptic in the air. Logan was sitting beside me, clutching my hand, tears running down his face. I looked at him. His lips were moving, saying something. But no sound came out. No heartbeat, no ambulance sirens, no doctors paging nurses, just an endless, silent void. They called it complete sensory neural hearing loss due to trauma, a deep damage that the doctors wouldn't promise could ever be reversed. People gave me sympathetic looks to comfort me. Logan stroked my hair and whispered things I had to read from his lips. "I'm here, you don't have to be afraid." At first I believed him. During the first few weeks after I was discharged, Logan rearranged everything in the house to help me adjust to my new life. Flashing lights for the doorbell, a voice-to-text app on my phone, little whiteboards in the kitchen so we could leave each other notes. He bought books to learn sign language and I started practicing lip reading. Evenings grew quieter. No music, no TV, warm lighting and polite nods instead of conversation. I tried not to be a burden. I cooked dinner ahead of time, kept it warm in the oven, and simply sat and watched Logan eat when he got home late. Every time he walked past me without a word, I told myself, he's probably tired. Jade and Riley, the 2 kids I once thought were the light of every day, still hugged me from behind at first. They still slid little handwritten notes under my door, "Get well soon, Esme." But then Margot arrived. She said she was there to help, that Logan needed another adult around for the kids while he worked. But within weeks, the air in the house began to shift. I remember one morning, Riley came up to me with a workbook, pointed at a few lines and spoke quickly. I couldn't read his lips fast enough. As I frowned and tried to sign repeat, Margot suddenly stepped out of the kitchen. Her voice was loud and clear. Because she knew I couldn't hear, so she didn't bother lowering it. "Sweetheart, look people in the eye when you speak. No need to yell, especially when they won't understand you anyway." I turned to look at her. She didn't look back, gave a slight smile and carried her teacup out to the back porch. After that, Riley talked to me less. Jade became more irritable. One time I caught her glaring at me through the mirror as I tried to pick up a stack of fallen books. I turned to ask for help, but all I saw was her door slamming shut. That night on the kitchen whiteboard, Logan had written exactly 3 words. "Don't push them." I didn't know what word could fully describe the feeling of being treated like a stranger in your own home. I started writing, not a journal, but notes. When Margot was home, how she spoke to Logan in the kitchen without once looking at me. When Jade came home late and whispered something to her father. When Logan would leave the room with his phone to take calls I was never allowed to know about. Small signs, quiet, but sharp, like little thorns growing under thin skin. I used to think losing my hearing was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. But after a few months of living in silence, I realized something even more terrifying. People begin to speak the truth when they believe you can't hear. Ever since Margot moved in, my already quiet home began to grow colder. Not winter cold, but a damp, creeping chill that came from glances, from tone, from being deliberately overlooked. At first she pretended to be polite, the usual niceties. "Do you need anything, Esme? You rest, dear, let me help Logan take care of the house." But those lines only came out when Logan was around. As soon as he left the room, she turned to the kids and changed her tone entirely. "Your mom is strong, but sometimes strength is an excuse to control others, don't you think, Jade? And Riley, you don't have to feel guilty for not understanding her. She's not really part of this family anymore." I was sitting less than 6 feet away on the sofa, pretending to focus on a book that was upside down. I was already used to not hearing people's footsteps, so they started believing they could say anything. One afternoon, Logan hadn't come home yet. Margot was having tea with the kids. I was peeling apples in the kitchen. As I walked past the table, she said clearly without looking at me, "If it were me, I wouldn't let myself become a burden. But everyone has their own way of living, I suppose." I set the plate of apples on the table, slowly, carefully, without making a sound. No one looked up, as if I were invisible. Around that time, I started noticing Logan's laptop more. He used to leave it open, now he locked the screen the moment I entered the room. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went down to the office to find some old medical records Jade needed for a school paper. His laptop was still open. I hesitated for a few seconds, then walked closer. On the screen was a banking interface, a trust account under my name, or more accurately, the account my mother had left me before she passed. Logan had once advised me not to touch it. "Keep it for emergencies. You're not in a stable place. Someone might take advantage." I believed him back then. But now, I saw transaction after transaction on the screen. On dates he said he was paying for roof repairs or investing in the kids' future. Transfers of $5,000, $10,000, even one wired to a law firm called McCabe and Simmons. I didn't know who McCabe was, but a few days later I had my answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from pain, but because my brain felt drenched in ice after reading the email he'd sent, the subject line still visible on the screen, notification. "Let's finalize the plan. She'll sign anything." I pretended to be asleep, listened to him lock the front door, then open the garage gate. The car reversed slowly. I stepped onto the second-floor balcony, peeking through the blinds. Logan's familiar black car parked across the street. A woman approached, tall, with long reddish-brown hair, wearing a beige dress. They spoke for a bit, then Logan laughed. Not a polite laugh. The same laugh he used to give me years ago when he played guitar in the kitchen and called me down to try his first roast chicken. My heart froze as he wrapped his arms around her. Then they kissed. I couldn't hear the sound of lips meeting, but I heard the tight clench of my heart. I backed into the room, my hand gripping the doorframe so hard it drew blood. I didn't cry, didn't do anything, because I knew. This wasn't emotion, it was evidence. Quietly, I went downstairs to the living room, where Margot always left her handbag wide open on the table. I reached in and pulled out a stack of documents. Copies of power of attorney over property assets. My name was printed next to the signature line, still blank, but it had a date. And every line reeked of fraud, stamped into every word. All they needed was for me to sign. Margot may have thought I was a silent fool, Logan may have believed I was a worn-out relic, but neither of them knew one thing. I was still watching. I don't remember how long I stood in front of the wooden drawer where Logan kept his documents. The key was still in the lock. He always assumed I'd never go through his personal things. Maybe he forgot one thing. When someone's been forced into silence long enough, they learn to observe and remember. I opened the drawer, my hand ice cold, and found a thick file clipped neatly inside a clear plastic folder. The first page had a bold title, Power of Attorney for Transfer of Assets and Accounts. Below that were my name, Logan's name, and a red underlined note. Transfer full usage rights of real estate and inheritance accounts under the name Esme Dawson for the purpose of marital asset consolidation and convenience in restructuring investments in California. The more I read, the colder I felt. The house my mother once called the final safe place, now part of my husband's investment strategy with his lawyer? I gripped the paper tightly. The sound of my fingernail scraping against the sheet echoed in my mind like metal dragging across wood. That was the only sound I could imagine during those months. I had heard nothing. I flipped to the last page. The signature box for me was still blank, but it already had a date and the name of the law firm, McCabe & Simmons. The name Kristen McCabe appeared below the legal certification section like a slap in the face. I remembered that name, not from the email I accidentally saw before. Kristen had been in Logan's MBA cohort. I met her once, at a party at Logan's friend's house. She shook my hand, eyes scanning me from head to toe, then tilted her head and said with a syrupy tone, "Well, Logan married a fascinating woman." I gave a polite smile back then. Looking back now, maybe she already thought I was temporary, and maybe, as she wished, I'd been marked for removal. That night, I didn't sleep in the bedroom. I waited until Logan fell asleep, then went back to the office and opened his computer. The password was still Riley's birthday, something Logan never changed because he used to say, "I have nothing to hide from you." Once again I wondered, how many things had he hidden simply because he thought I'd never be clear-headed enough to look? I opened his email, the sent folder, a message marked with a red star at the top. To Kristen, draft file of power of attorney and asset valuation. Mom says she can move out by the end of the month if she signs at the right time. The house has been reappraised. If we sell next month, the gross profit might be enough to open the office in Santa Monica like we planned. Check and send it to the notary. Logan, Kristen wasn't just the other woman. She was a partner. In every sense. I opened the attachment, a detailed appraisal of the house. The house titled in my name, inherited from my mother. Every piece of furniture listed, every square foot of the yard, every upgrade I paid for, all calculated to support the financial purpose of re-establishing the new living structure. I leaned back in the chair, completely hollow. It didn't feel like heartbreak. It felt like cold. Deep, slow, and so cold it no longer hurt. The next morning, I tried something. I took the original power of attorney form and brought it to the kitchen. Logan was eating breakfast. Wearing a light blue shirt, hair still damp from his shower. He looked like the perfect husband. I placed the document in front of him and signed, "Explain this." Logan froze for less than a second, then smiled that familiar gentle smile. "Oh, that? I was going to ask you to sign it last week. It's just paperwork, formalities in case there's ever an emergency with the assets. You understand, right?" He reached out and touched my cheek. "I know you hate paperwork, but I did this for both our safety. Trust me." That last line was nearly a whisper, but I didn't trust anymore. I folded the paper neatly, slipped it into my jacket pocket. Logan sat there, as if everything was fine. And I smiled too. Not to forgive, but to let him believe. I still didn't know a thing. But from that day on, I started measuring time differently. Not in dates, but in evidence I was collecting. And with each passing moment, the truth became a little clearer. For the first time in months, I could hear again the window creaking in the wind, the doctor's pen tapping lightly on the table, and her warm voice echoing clearly. Like someone had finally pulled me out of a long, soundless dream. "Congratulations, Esme," said Dr. Celeste Patel, her eyes kind as she removed her gloves. "The device is responding well. Neural signals are beginning to recover. There's no rush, but if you'd like, you can start training your hearing again today." Part of me wanted to leap up and hug someone, but the rest of me felt nothing. Like I'd waited for this moment too long, and now that it was real, I didn't know what to feel anymore. I told no one. I left the clinic that day with a nearly invisible hearing aid tucked behind my hair. Every step on the sidewalk made a sound I had forgotten. Dry leaves crunching, distant horns, a mother calling her child in the parking lot across the street. Everything sounded so clear, it hurt. When I got home, I closed the door softly and sat down. waiting for nightfall. The kitchen was where all their plans began. I picked a night when Margot stayed for dinner, something that had become common since she started claiming, "I care for that girl like my own daughter." Logan hadn't been joining dinners much lately, but that night was different. They sat across from each other, 2 glasses of wine on the table, and a salad I had made that afternoon. I pretended to go to bed early, placed a fingernail-size recorder under the dining table, hidden from the light. Around 8 p.m., when the house had gone quiet, they started speaking. "Kristen sent over the draft contract," Logan said, voice low but clear. "As long as Esme signs, everything is legal. The investment firm will release funds in 10 days. "And she still suspects nothing?" Margot asked, nudging her wine glass. "No. She still looks at me like I'm the only one who could save her," he snorted. "She's weaker than I thought." I stood by the doorway, behind the wall that separated the living room, one hand gripping the stair rail. The hearing aid seemed to magnify every word. Each sentence was a blade. No shouting needed to slice trust to pieces. "Good," Margot continued. "That house was her mother's, but no one knows its real value like I do. That land will double in 3 years. Don't miss the window." "I know," Logan said. "The issue is timing. She won't sign unless the reason feels urgent." "Then create a reason," Margot exhaled, cold as stone. "Push her into dependence. Bring up finances, scare her about losing the house over unpaid taxes, anything that'll make her panic." I quietly turned away and pulled out my phone, enabled auto backup, and uploaded the audio file to the cloud. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my mother's old office, the place where she used to journal every evening, and I began writing it all down. Every conversation, every expression, every suspicious detail I'd once dismissed as stress or pressure. 3 days later, I called Harper Quinn, the attorney who had handled my mother's will. Harper was a Boston native, with a voice as steady as a metronome and eyes sharp enough to see through someone's skin and straight into motive. "Esme," she said after I introduced myself, "I didn't expect to hear from you again after all these years." "I need you," I said. "And I think you were right." "About Logan?" She took a deep breath. "Start from the beginning, every detail." "I did. I left nothing out." Harper didn't interrupt. She took notes. When I mentioned the name Kristen McCabe, she paused. "She used to work at the California State Land Office, was once accused of taking illegal kickbacks during a public auction deal. I'll look into it." "And Logan?" "Let me repeat," Harper said slowly. "The assets your mother left behind cannot be transferred without valid authorization. If they're pressuring you to sign while you're mentally or physically unwell, that's illegal. So, if I've regained my hearing, but they don't know, and I've recorded the entire plan, then you're sitting on gold, Esme." Harper paused. "But be smart. Stay quiet. Not a single sign that you know the truth, not until we've built enough of a case to strike from every angle." I no longer felt alone. I wasn't the silent woman behind closed doors anymore, waiting for pity from her husband. I was coming back. Ears open, mind sharp, and armed with every piece of evidence I'd quietly collected. Jade had always been more perceptive than she looked. She wasn't the cuddly or smiley type like Riley, but her eyes constantly scanned the small things. Since I moved into this house, Jade had always kept a certain distance. Not cold, not close. She looked at me like she was waiting to see if I would stay or disappear, like every other adult who had passed through her childhood. But lately, that look had started to change. One night early in the week, while Logan was away on a business trip and Margot had gone out for dinner with her card club friends, I was folding blankets on the sofa when Jade walked into the living room. She was barefoot, clutching her iPad to her chest like it held something fragile. She didn't speak at first, just sat down on the edge of the couch, gently biting her bottom lip. I looked over, waiting. Finally, her voice came out in a whisper. "Esme, if someone loves another person while still living with the one they married, is that wrong?" I placed the blanket in my lap, my hand still holding the fold, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew I had to choose my words carefully. I turned to her. No avoidance. Jade's eyes looked eerily like mine, like someone searching for truth in silence when trust had run out. And I understood, more than words could ever explain. Instead of answering, I reached over, rested my hand on her shoulder and gave a slow nod. Jade didn't ask anything else. She rested her head gently on my shoulder, then stood up and said, like nothing had happened, "Dad says I should start going to bed earlier." I smiled. But that night, I saw her bedroom light stay on later than usual, and the next morning, I found a folded note left on the dining table. "I'll keep watch. Don't worry." Riley was different. He was still an 11-year-old boy, sweet and curious, obsessed with remote control cars and mint chocolate. He often slipped into my room in the afternoons to ask if I needed help with anything, then pretended to look for the TV remote to stay a little longer. But then, Riley began to change too. One Saturday morning, I was washing vegetables in the kitchen when I heard hurried footsteps. Riley came running down the hallway, face pale, hands clutching the hem of his pajama shirt. I quickly dried my hands and bent down. "What's wrong, Riley?" He shook his head, but his eyes were red. I led him to the couch and let him sit. A few minutes later, his voice was so small I had to lean in close to hear. "I heard, Grandma called you a stupid cripple." My chest tightened, but I kept my voice calm. I placed my hand on his knee and gently rubbed it. "Where did you hear that?" "In the office," he whispered. "I was looking for markers. The door was cracked, she was on the phone. I didn't think she'd—" Riley's voice caught. I saw the fear. Not just from the words, but from feeling betrayed by someone he thought was safe. Just like I once had. I pulled him into my arms. After a long pause, Riley asked quietly, "Does it make you sad when people think that?" "Yes. But I don't let it make me weak. I don't want Grandma to talk about you like that again." I looked down at his little face, scrunched with anger on my behalf. I didn't say anything, just smoothed his hair. In that moment, I knew. Riley had chosen a side too. In the days that followed, I began noticing more subtle shifts in the house we all thought was under Logan and Margot's control. Jade no longer let Margot brush her hair in the morning. Riley clearly refused to go into her room, claiming he had group homework. And sometimes, when I walked into the living room and found both kids sitting together, there'd be a beat of silence, like I had interrupted something. Once, I saw Jade pull Riley close, whisper something in his ear, and then both of them turned to look at me, not with fear, with a nod, quiet and slow, like a promise made without words. I didn't know how much they had heard or how much they understood, but I knew one thing for sure: I was no longer alone. And if Logan thought the kids would always be pawns in his game, he was wrong. That night's dinner was so polished it felt fake. The table was set early with the gold-rimmed china Margot always said was for special occasions. Logan wore a crisp white shirt and the cedarwood cologne I gave him our first year living together. Margot sat at the head of the table, red wine in hand, unable to hide her smug satisfaction. Riley and Jade were allowed to eat in the living room, so the grown-ups could talk privately. Margot's favorite way of controlling situations without explanation. I took my seat like always, calm, my hands resting lightly on my dress. Only I knew what lay beneath the fabric, a small phone live stream app already running. The stream was connected to a private group Harper had created, to herself, her legal assistant, and one more. The Deputy District Attorney of Pierce County. I'd waited for this day too long. Logan cleared his throat. He didn't look at me as he placed a neatly bound folder on the table. "Just some legal housekeeping," he said, voice smooth as honey. "You know, to make things easier to manage." I picked up the folder with both hands, flipping slowly through each page like I needed time to understand. I nodded slightly, my eyes scanning the familiar lines. My name, the transfer clauses, the legal certification. Everything they once thought I was too clueless to grasp. When I turned to the last page, Logan was already holding out the pen, gently placing it on the table, murmuring, "I can walk you through it again if you need." "I think I don't need to." Margot narrowed her eyes. "Esme, is something wrong?" I pulled the phone from beneath my dress and placed it on the table. With one slow, deliberate motion, I pressed play. From the tiny speaker, Logan's voice rang out, clear and sharp. "If she signs, we flip the house in 2 months. I already promised Kristen, and if she resists, we'll say she's unstable." Logan froze, his face draining of color as if all the blood had vanished. Margot shot up from her seat, reaching for the phone. But I was faster. I raised it high, eyes locked on hers. "Don't touch it, it's streaming live." "What the hell are you doing?" Margot snapped, her voice stripped of its usual calm. "Something I should have done a long time ago," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it filled the kitchen. Logan stammered. You've been able to hear? Since before you called me a burden. Since you said I had no value, except legal. Since the day you hugged your lawyer outside the car, while your son was inside making you a birthday card." He opened his mouth to say something, but I raised a hand. "Don't lie again, Logan. Everything's been recorded. Audio, video, already sent." I hit the second button on the phone. The next voice was Margot's. "Push her to depend on us, mention losing the house, pressure her, if needed, hire someone to mess with her head." Margot's tone on the recording wasn't that of a concerned mother. It was the voice of a seasoned manipulator. "I suggest you sit," I said, still calm. "You and Logan need to hear the final part." She glared at me. I played the third recording. Logan and Kristen's conversation while he thought I was asleep. Harper had enhanced the audio. Every word was crystal clear. "I don't love her, Kristen. I love what being married to her gives me. She's a gateway, nothing more." The kitchen, once filled with laughter and the clink of silverware, now held nothing but the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. I looked down, opened the folder Logan had handed me. I flipped through the pages slowly, like I was still weighing my decision. Then I picked up the pen and wrote across the signature line, "Declined, deliberate fraud, and coercion." I placed the pen down, closed the folder, and slid it back toward him. "Thank you for handing over the evidence yourself. Now, my lawyer will handle the rest." Margot shot to her feet, voice trembling. "You won't get away with this. You think you're smarter than us?" "No, I don't think so, but I do know one thing. Liars always underestimate the people they believe are weak." Logan lowered his head, hands clenched tight, no longer able to look at me. Less than 48 hours later, Harper sent me a copy of the order to freeze all assets jointly held by me and Logan, including the house my mother left me, our bank accounts, and the investment portfolio he once tried to hide under a shell corporation's name. "I want to make one thing clear," Harper said over the phone, her voice cold as steel. "They don't get the chance to wipe anything clean before it sees the light of day." The next day, the prosecutor's office officially accepted the complaint against Logan for 3 charges: falsifying legal documents, conspiring to defraud assets of significant value, and intentionally coercing someone with temporary diminished capacity to sign over property. They called it a form of emotional and legal coercion, a relatively new term, but increasingly recognized as a sophisticated form of abuse in marriage. At the same time, Margot was summoned to participate in the investigation as an accomplice. The audio recordings I provided, in which she instructed Logan to apply psychological pressure, use financial threats, and stage pity to force a signature, became indisputable evidence. Harper said what she didn't expect is that by underestimating you, she talked more than she should have. Margot responded exactly as I expected. She hired her own lawyer, denied all responsibility, and blamed Logan as the mastermind. But that defense didn't hold up against the transaction history linking my accounts to a California real estate brokerage where Kristen McCabe once served on the board. And then Kristen? The Washington State Bar Disciplinary Board announced her license was suspended indefinitely. The reason: severe ethical violations, collusion in document forgery, and unauthorized asset transfer. Kristen remained silent during the investigation, but a former colleague who anonymously messaged Harper revealed that Kristen had used the same tactic on an elderly client years ago, escaping consequences due to lack of proof. Not this time. I didn't go to court hoping to win. I wanted it to end. The morning I signed the divorce papers, there was soft sunlight over Seattle. I arrived at Harper's office alone, wearing a gray sweater my mother once bought in Portland, carrying nothing but the recordings, and a letter from Dr. Patel, confirming I had been temporarily incapacitated at the time Logan began orchestrating the signature scheme. Harper read every line carefully, then looked at me over her dark brown frames. "You're stronger than any client I've ever represented." Strength wasn't in what I could say, it was in the fact that I was still sitting there, not shaking. The divorce petition was filed alongside a claim for psychological damages, a request to preserve all property in its current state, and a formal demand for sole ownership of the house. The home under my name, rightfully my mother's inheritance. "He'll object," I said. "He can," Harper shrugged. "But in the eyes of the court, every blame-shifting argument falls apart when it's played back in their own voice." That was enough. That night, I went home and packed everything that belonged to me. No shouting, no warnings. I quietly removed each photo frame my mother had hung on the wall. I opened the small safe in the bedroom, where I kept her final letter to me, with one line handwritten in blue ink. "You don't need to keep this house to prove anything. But if someone tries to take it from you without love, don't let it happen." I used to think I didn't have the courage, but it turns out courage is the ability to quietly record every seemingly meaningless word, to gather the fragments until the full picture of truth comes into focus. The next morning, the divorce was finalized with clear terms. I kept all inherited assets, Logan was barred from entering the home during the investigation, and his entire financial history would be audited for the past 5 years. None of them thought I would flip the script. But they forgot one thing. The moment I was silent was when I heard most clearly who was lying. I left that house on a rainless morning, but the sky was heavy, like everything I had ever held on to, tried to patch together, or swallowed in silence had soaked into the brick walls, the floorboards, even the air between the frames I'd taken down. Jade waited on the front steps, clutching her backpack strap like she wasn't sure I'd let her come. I paused, placed my suitcase in the trunk, then turned back. "Are you sure?" I asked. The words came out soft as wind, but my heart was racing. "I don't want to stay with them," she said, eyes not meeting mine, as if hiding her fear. "I know I've never said it, but I've always felt safe around you." I walked up and placed my hand on her shoulder. In that moment, her gaze lifted and met mine. Then, for the first time since I stepped into the lives of those 2 children, she said. Jade and I rented a small apartment in Fremont, north of Seattle, not big but full of light. The kitchen window faced the lake, and in the mornings you could hear ducks gliding across the water, the breeze lifting the curtains like a soft breath after a long night. Jade had her own room. She painted the walls olive green, hung her hand-drawn artwork on reclaimed wood frames, and strung fairy lights around her desk. Riley, still living with his father, began visiting every weekend. No one made him, he chose it himself. "Once?" I asked gently. "You doing okay?" Riley nodded. "Grandma's not there anymore. But I miss how the house used to feel. It's easier to breathe here." I started my new work by sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, opening my laptop, and typing the first line of a new project. Listening is a form of healing. Listening not to reply, but to understand, and to give a voice to those who had been dismissed, interrupted, or silenced for far too long. That's how the listening room was born. I bought a small art center that had closed after the pandemic. A modest red brick building nestled between 2 old cafes. Inside it had a small wooden stage, light brown walls, and rows of vintage chairs I kept almost untouched. I didn't want it to be too polished. I wanted people to walk in and feel like they didn't have to pretend. Harper was the first to attend the opening seminar. She sat in the front row, a small notebook in hand as always. I didn't say her name out loud, but when my eyes landed on her seat, she nodded. The kind of nod only someone who has seen both ruin and resurrection can give. I invited others to speak. A woman who had been financially deceived by her second husband. An elderly man whose own child had stolen guardianship to sell off his inheritance. A college senior whose professor demanded favors in exchange for graduating on time. Each with a different story, but all sharing one feeling, being forced into silence, and slowly believing they didn't deserve to speak. When it was my turn, I didn't start with Logan. I talked about the morning I couldn't hear the garbage truck pass like usual and thought I was still dreaming. I spoke about the look in a man's eyes pretending to love me when he knew I couldn't respond. And the night I heard every word they said, while they still believed I was nothing more than a decoration in the house. After the session, a middle-aged woman approached me. She didn't ask anything, just held my hand, her eyes welling up. "You have no idea how much you helped me," she said. "My husband told me I was losing my mind when I found out he was hiding money. I started believing maybe I really was unstable. You weren't. They're afraid of what we see when we finally open our eyes." Jade joined me after school. She managed our social media, designed posters, edited presentation slides. One day, I opened the office door and found her taping a small printed message to the glass. "We don't need to scream to be heard." I stood there, watching her press it onto the entrance window. A moment later, she turned, saw me watching, and smiled softly. "That quote was yours, but now, it's ours too." I walked over and pulled her into a hug. Jade tensed for a second, then wrapped her arms around me, tightly. No words were spoken, but I knew I was never a decoration. I hadn't been in the right place to see my own worth. And now, I had found that place, not in forced silence, but in intentional listening, where everyone gets to be seen, heard, and believed. I've always loved early morning light. Not the harsh noon sun, but that delicate glow filtering through linen curtains, casting soft golden dust across the wooden floor. That morning, I stood by the living room window at the listening room, holding a small card made from recycled paper, its edges slightly curled from being held too long in the warmth of my hand. Jade had left it on the kitchen table without me noticing. She had her own way of showing love, quiet, thoughtful, unembellished. But every word on that card made my heart ache in the best way. I used to think silence was scary, but you taught me that it's also strength. Thank you, Mom. I don't know when she wrote those words. Maybe one evening while I was preparing materials for the next seminar, or one morning while I was watering the plants on the porch. But that doesn't matter. I gently touched the words, "Thank you, Mom," words I once thought I would never hear from a child who didn't share my blood. Not everyone understands the journey of a mother who didn't give birth, but chose to love as if she had. I was afraid too. Afraid I would always be the second wife, the latecomer, the Miss Esme, instead of Mom. But once love is rooted in presence, not title, you no longer need anyone to name you. You know in your heart you're doing the right thing. I walked around the room, card still in hand. The small plants along the wall, picked and named by Riley, were beginning to bud after the cold spell. On the bookshelf was a photo I had snapped of Harper and the guests at our very first seminar. They were laughing, talking, raising hands, crying, all of it real. I stopped in front of an oil painting on the wall. The brush strokes still a little rough, the colors uneven, but in the center was a woman standing in a room full of mirrors. Each mirror reflected a different version of her. One curled into herself, one bound at the wrists, one smiling gently, and in the very center, she stood upright, eyes forward, holding a microphone. "Jade gave me that painting on my birthday. This is you. When I see with my eyes, not with what others say." The card was still in my hand, and I read it again, as if every word held the sound I'd missed for so long. "But you taught me that it's also strength. Some fears grow quietly in silence, the fear of being left behind, of not being believed, of being unnecessary." I had lived with those fears for months, maybe years, never quite naming them. I thought that if I stayed quiet, didn't bother anyone, I'd be allowed to stay. But it turned out that was where I learned to hear my own voice. That voice didn't shout, didn't demand belief, but it was steady enough to rise, to walk away from a place that no longer deserved me, and to build a new space, where people once called too weak, too invisible, too complicated, could sit down, exhale, and be fully heard. Silence can be a beginning too. Have you ever been dismissed simply because you were quiet? Have you ever had someone try to erase your voice, only to realize in that very silence you had become stronger than ever before. I know every person listening will feel something different. Maybe you've been Esme, or maybe you've sat beside someone like her, not knowing what to do. If you want to share, leave your thoughts in the comments. Because maybe your story, the one you've been holding, might be the light someone else is searching for in the dark. And if you're drawn to honest, emotional stories about choice, forgiveness, and how we begin again at the very place we thought everything ended, don't forget to follow this channel. Each week will bring you fragments of everyday life, sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful, but always grounded in one unchanging truth: a belief in kindness, and the power of truly listening to ourselves.